All right, so thanks everyone for coming. My session today is called Lightning Components 101, an Apex Developer's Guide. First, I want to start off by thanking the new Delhi Salesforce developer group for having me. Sushant, did you want to talk about this slide or do you want me to talk through it?
Yeah. Thanks, Adam. Okay, so guys, we are New Delhi Salesforce Developer Group, and we are in the Salesforce community since 2016. It's been 4 years for like we are participating and interacting with Salesforce community with our various initiatives. So, Impact Salesforce Saturday is one of the initiative where we will come up with news. Topics or new webinar series every Saturday of every month, and now it's consistent. This session is again part of our Impact Salesforce Saturday, and I urge everyone to join every session because in future, in upcoming months, we are coming with lots of series. Not a single session, but a series of sessions for a particular specific topic. These are our social media links. You can follow us on Twitter, and we have our official website newdelhisfdc.com. You can visit there where you can find all the slides and videos related to this current session as well as the previous sessions. So Adam, can you please move ahead one slide? Yeah, so our another session, our another initiative is like a Mentorship Central. This is a platform where we are allowing our mentors and mentee to connect them. So those who are really new to the Salesforce ecosystem, and they are finding some mentor, then they can visit our website, sign up there as a mentor or a mentee as per your experience, and then you can like this is really a great kickstart for your career. Like all the experienced guys like Adam and along with that all the MVPs, or these are like our mentors, and they can help us in like learning new things in Salesforce ecosystem. So you can like leverage this platform as well in order to start learning. Yeah, so Adam, I think we are done with our intro, and now the stage is yours. Go ahead.
Awesome, thanks Sushant. All right, so as Sushant mentioned, my name is Adam Olshansky. I'm a Salesforce MVP and Salesforce engineer at Google. I have over 600 Trailhead badges and 14 certifications, but I'm really most passionate about helping people learn to code on the Salesforce platform. I've also been a Rad Women coach a few times, and I love getting involved in the community and thrilled to be speaking to you all today. Feel free to connect with me afterward on Twitter, Adam17AMO. Shoot me an email or check out my blog at adamtoarchitect.com. And so we're going to be presenting on Lightning Web Components today. And so hopefully you're already on the Lightning experience, but if you're not or know someone who needs some help migrating over, I have a Pluralsight course at bit.ly/lightning migration that might be helpful as well. All right, so with that, I just want to say namaste and dhanyavad for inviting me to speak to you all today. I had the pleasure of visiting Delhi about 1.5 years ago for India Dreamin'. Had a lot of fun, took some pictures, got to go see the Taj Mahal, met a lot of great people, saw a lot of great sessions. And so while I'm sad I'm not able to be with you physically in person, I'm happy to be able to speak to you all virtually as well. All right, so with that, I kind of want to start off talking about why I wanted to present on this topic. So I started off, like some of you might have, as a Java developer. And from Java, I went into Apex, and I was very happy, and still I'm happy, working on the backend side of things. And as I've kind of gone up my developer mountain career, I've started hearing terms here and there, right? Front end, JavaScript, client side, all these terms come in. And I knew them enough to the point that they weren't foreign to me, but I couldn't necessarily explain them in a good amount of depth. And I kind of pushed them off to the side and figured I'd learn about it later without worrying about it too much, and kept going up my career mountain here. And at some point, I started seeing statistics like this. This was a survey done by Stack Overflow, website many of you are probably familiar with, from 2019. They did a survey, 72,000 professional developers. And for the 7th year in a row, they found that JavaScript is the most popular popular development language. Second was HTML and CSS. So the languages of the web really heavily used by the developer community at large. Like I mentioned, 7th year in a row for JavaScript as per Stack Overflow. GitHub also did some kind of aggregates. GitHub also did some aggregates of its data, and it found that, again, for the 7th year in a row since 2013, JavaScript has been #1 in GitHub pull requests. And some more people commit pull requests in JavaScript than anything else. For those of you curious, Apex is number 39 on that list. But it's pretty apparent that JavaScript is here to stay. It's popular. It's been popular for a while now. And like I mentioned, I was kind of putting off these terms to the side. And so one day I kind of took a look around and said, oh, this is a big front-end heavy kind of programming world we're in right now. And I don't know very much of it. I kind of felt like I was at the top of a mountain with no support and not really a good way about how to move forward. And so backend's been safe, but I realized it was time to get into front-end development as well. So that was kind of the reason I wanted to dive into front-end. I figured there were probably other people in the same position as me, and so that's kind of the impetus for this talk today. So my expectation is that you have some familiarity with Apex already. I don't want you walking out of here thinking you're going to know how to code in JavaScript in 40 minutes. Not sure 40 hours would be enough. But what I do want you to understand is common patterns we see in Lightning Web Components and how they're similar to what you're already doing, and then a couple tips and tricks, hopefully, to give you some confidence so the front end isn't so scary anymore, and you can start building your own Lightning Web Components after the talk today as well. And so I'm kind of branding this as step 1 on your front-end developer journey. All right, so we're going to do a very kind of brief Apex overview, cover stuff we already know. We're going to talk about what is a Lightning component, do a brief demo of Visualforce versus Lightning Web Components, a deep dive into Lightning Web Components with a couple more demos, and then we're going to wrap things up and talk about, all right, now that we've done our first step, how do we go and take step 2 and step 3 and beyond? I originally, when I was going to come up with this talk, was going to include Aura components in here. But at this point, if you haven't already started learning about Aura components, you're better off just skipping it and moving straight to Lightning Web Components. And we'll talk about why a little bit later on. All right, so let's talk about stuff we're familiar with first. This is just Apex, kind of what we already know, what we're familiar with. All right, so we're familiar with Apex. There's kind of 2 flavors of it, right? We have triggers, and then we have classes and controllers. And your triggers are where all your events live, right? Your before insert, after update, your database events. Your database events fire off your code. And then your classes and controllers are going to have your methods, your parameters, your return statements. And then kind of mixed in there are going to be variables, right? So we're familiar with all of this here. We're also probably familiar with annotations in code, right? We might see at future, we might see, invocable Apex if we're working with process builder or flow. And we're also familiar with interfaces and things like batchable that give us some extra properties as well. All right. We're also probably familiar to some extent with Visualforce, right? This button-based UI, what's known as the MVC model view controller. We're familiar with the HTML style tags Visualforce uses, right? Apex page, Apex input, all these tags that make up our UI. And then we're familiar with linking our Visualforce to our Apex controller, referring to methods and variables using bind notation, right? The curly bracket bang to refer to methods and variables in our Apex from our UI, right? So we already kind of know how to do all this. But as you're also probably aware, there are some gaps with the Apex Visualforce model, right? We're subjected to governor limits. It's very much button click based. And ultimately that leads to poor performance. And as we've seen, JavaScript's been king for a while now. People want this more responsive UI and don't want to have to be clicking buttons all the time. And ultimately, to kind of give the people what they want, it's yielded some, let's say, hacky solutions, right? We'll go online, we'll find a script tag, we'll find some JavaScript. Maybe we know what it does, maybe we don't, but it seems to work. So we throw it in there, it works. Might not be proud of it, but it works well enough, so we're happy with it and we move on. And that'll get us so far to a point, but at some point we really need to figure out what's going on and figure out a best practice way to implement some of this functionality. And so that's what we want to get away from in Visualforce and move toward in Lightning components. All right, so now that we kind of brief overview of what we already know, let's talk about this new programming model. So we're familiar with MVC. And we're going to be changing the model a little bit into what some call MVCC, I like to call MVC++. And so first I want to talk about a brief kind of Salesforce development journey that Salesforce has been on. September 2017, right? Salesforce has been around for a few years now. They realized people wanted to build their own UIs. So Dreamforce 2007, they launched Visualforce, and now you could build UIs, custom UIs in Salesforce. And that was great for a while, but we've seen since around 2013 or so, JavaScript and responsive UIs have really been popular. So Salesforce responded to that. Frameworks were very heavy. You probably heard about frameworks like React or Angular. And so Salesforce took an open source framework called Aura and developed the Aura Lightning Component framework. Utilizing the Aura open source Aura framework, came up with this Lightning Component framework that you can build custom UIs using front-end JavaScript and stuff like that. And so that was August 2015, this model came out, along with kind of the Lightning Experience rollout. And a couple of years have passed, and Salesforce realized that the web standards have been changing and they need to change with it. And so that's where this Lightning Web Component model has come into play. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But January 2019, so a little over a year old now, the Lightning Web Component framework was born. And that's kind of going to be Salesforce's development, preferred mode of development moving forward, at least for the foreseeable future. But all of this has been based on kind of customer needs and wants. All right, so here's where we were with Visualforce, right? We had our user sitting on their computer. They made a call out to the server, which is Salesforce. Salesforce is going to load the UI. Salesforce is going to call the code. Salesforce is going to talk to the database, right? The objects and fields. All of this is happening on the Salesforce side. So the user has to make a call out to Salesforce. That all has to happen. And then Salesforce has to make a call back, return everything to the user. So there's going to be a performance hit with the two-way calls there. All right, so that's how MVC is working. And we're going to change this a little bit now. So we're going to keep the Apex controller on Salesforce. We're going to keep the database on Salesforce. That's fine. But we're also going to move the view to what's called the client side, or the user's browser, essentially. Right, so in the user's browser now, they're going to have the view. I don't have to make a call to Salesforce for the view anymore. But realistically, what good is the view if every time I want to do anything with it, I have to make a call to Salesforce anyway? So we're going to add a second controller on the client side as well. That's going to be our front-end JavaScript controller. So now when the browser loads, it's going to load the view and it's going to load a client-side controller. And that's going to handle a lot of the responsive events. If you need to make a call to Salesforce, your Apex controller is still available and your database isn't going anywhere. But now we've moved the view and added a controller to the client side. So that's why it's often referred to as MVCC, because we now have two different controllers. We're working with front end and a back end. Right, so like with Apex, we had two different flavors. Same thing with Lightning components. So when people say we want to build a Lightning component, what does that really entail? And all a Lightning component really is it's a bundle or collection of files that intrinsically know about each other. So previously I had this Visualforce page that was sitting on its own and I had to tell it what Apex controller I wanted to talk to, etc. But now with a Lightning component, I'm going to get a bunch of files that already know about each other. I don't have to tell my component UI what controller to use because it's part of the bundle. So think of it as like a folder on your desktop where all the files know about each other already, right? So I can have a UI file, I can have a controller, I can have a CSS, I can have an XML file. They all know about each other. I don't have to say, hey, UI, go talk to this controller because it already knows which one to talk to. And again, we're going to be focusing specifically on the Lightning Web Component side. So you might hear the term Lightning Component. Today, we're going to be focusing on the Lightning Web Component specifically. All right, so before we get into what's new with components, let's talk about what's not new, right? What's old with components? What do you already know how to do that works more or less the same way in components? And so there are 5 different things I want to kind of go into in depth here real quick. The first one is this concept of component-based UI. So in our old framework in Visualforce, we're familiar with these Apex tags, right? We see Apex page button, Apex input, Apex page block, right? We have these Apex tags we throw into Visualforce. That concept isn't changing, just the names of the tags are. So because we're using some kind of web standards now with Lightning Web Components, we're going to be taking in standard HTML tags. So some of the tags aren't going to be specific to Salesforce anymore. Good news is I don't have to Google Salesforce in front of everything I'm searching for. I can just Google the name of the tag and it's going to bring up the functionality of it. Because it's a Lightning Web Component framework, we are going to have some custom tags that start with Lightning. So instead of Apex input, we're going to have Lightning input, right, et cetera. And then we're also going to have custom tags. So we might want to bring in additional components, right? You might be familiar with this Visualforce component concept as well, but we're going to want to have the capability to bring in other Lightning Web Components into our parent component. And for that, we're going to use tags that'll usually start with the letter C or whatever namespace you're in. So if you're working on a managed package for an ISV, your namespace might be different, but by default, it'll be the letter C. So we'll see an example of that in a little bit. But this concept of tag-based UI, we're already pretty familiar with in Visualforce. The concept of code running in response to an event, we're already familiar with that as well with triggers, right? A database event happens before insert, and then our trigger fires. And the same thing is going to happen in Lightning Web Components. The only difference is instead of waiting for database events, we now need to respond to client-side or browser events. So we're going to be responding to things like when the user clicks a button, when the user changes some text that they're typing in. So on change, on click, events like that. Events that are happening in the browser, we want code to automatically fire as a result. Again, similar to Visualforce, when you click a button and fire off an action, same thing's going to happen in the LWC world as well. Bind variables are pretty much the same as well. We're familiar with this from Visualforce, right? We want to reference a variable in our Apex controller. We put up the curly bracket bang and refers to the Apex variable. Same sort of thing in LWC. We're just changing the syntax slightly, taking away the exclamation point, but we're still going to have the curly brackets to indicate that we want to talk to a variable in our controller. And in our case, our client-side UI is going to talk to our client-side JavaScript controller. The same thing with methods. We reference methods from Visualforce to our Apex controller, and we're going to reference methods from our Lightning Web Component UI in our JavaScript controller. And that syntax, again, we're going to take off the exclamation point, but we're still going to see the curly brackets in there. Because we have two controllers now, though, we also need to have a way to reference our Apex controller methods from our JavaScript controller. And we're going to be able to, just like we would a variable, come up with custom names for how we're going to reference those methods. And we'll see an example of that in a little bit. But for the most part, the idea of calling methods, referencing methods from a UI and a controller, that's not changing. And lastly, this concept of using multiple files to build our application, right? Before we had a Visualforce page, we had an Apex controller it was talking to, we had an Apex helper, utility file maybe. So we had a bunch of multiple files. Maybe we're bringing in a CSS static resource. And again, we're going to have the same thing here. We're going to have an HTML UI file. We're going to have a JavaScript controller. We might have an Apex controller, right? But we're used to dealing with multiple files that are going to make up our component already. Right, so all of those things are staying the same. All right, so let's do a little comparison here of Visualforce Lightning Web Component. I'm going to do a demo of both of them, and then we're going to look at the code that makes them happen. And, okay. So let's go into our first component here. So I have a component that says hello world, and this is my Visualforce page. So this is my hello VF component. And I'm going to type in here hello, hello Delhi. Right, so I have the word hello, I'm typing in Delhi, I click a button that says update, I wait half a second, and then I see now my UI says hello Delhi. So I can change this if I want. I can say hello India, I can update it and it's going to change. Right, so I have to click a button, I have to wait for the call and response, calling Salesforce, but it works. If I come down here to my Lightning Web Component though, I again have hello world as a default. And I'm going to type this in here, Delhi, and without clicking any buttons, I see my UI is responsive. It's changing as I'm typing. So if I type in hello India a little bit slower, you can see as I'm typing each letter, it's showing up right above in this text here. No button clicking, no anything. It's happening in response to a browser event. Right? And so for this Lightning Web Component here, no Apex. I'm not having to make calls to Salesforce. All of this is happening in the browser. So let's go take a look at the code that makes that happen here. All right, so I start off with Visualforce. Here's my hello world.page, Visualforce page here. And I see a couple things. I'm telling it what controller I'm using. I'm using a controller called Hello World Controller. Then I have Apex output text that is going to output my value, and an Apex input that I'm going to be able to type something into. We see I also have a command button here that when I press the button, it's going to re-render my output value. So when I click the button, the output value changes. I also see my output text is going to be referencing the greeting variable. We see the bind variable syntax there. And then I see my input is also referring to the greeting variable using the bind variable syntax. So I type something in the greeting, I click my button, it updates my variable, and then outputs it in the output text. Right, so my controller for this, pretty straightforward. It's one line, it's my getter and setter for my greeting variable, and that's it. But I do need Apex, and I do need everything to happen in Salesforce. Make the call to Salesforce from my browser and have Salesforce respond back to me. If I take a look at my Hello World LWC, though, I have a Lightning Web Component called hello world.html. And aside from the names of the components being different, it looks pretty similar to my Visualforce page. Again, I have an output tag, in this case, the standard HTML paragraph tag, P. And again, I have an input tag. Again, instead of my Apex input tag, I have a Lightning input tag now, but it does the same thing. And again, I see my output tag is just outputting hello greeting, where greeting is a bind variable. And I see my input is again referring to a value of greeting. We also see one of these browser events I was talking about before, on change. So when the value of my input changes, similar to how we're re-rendering it on the button click, we're going to automatically call some code in response to that on change event. So I have my greeting variable, and on change, it's going to call a method called handle change. And again, handle change is in the bind method syntax. All right, so this is the entire HTML. And this is the entire JavaScript controller. So this is my hello world controller.js. Again, I don't have to tell it what controller it needs to talk to. It's all part of my component, so it knows what controller it needs to look at. And I see a couple new keywords here. The first one is going to be import. I also see export here. Whenever you're building Lightning Web Components, if you're familiar with Java, you're already familiar with this concept of importing things. But basically, we're going to be able to bring in functionality from different libraries, different parts of Salesforce, different components, pretty much anything we want, and make it a part of our component. So pretty much any Lightning Web Component you're going to see is always going to import from the LWC namespace. And it's going to bring in this Lightning element. And then we're going to, again, standard line, just part of the template for building a controller, just like you have when you build an Apex controller and you have the public class name. Same sort of thing here. I'm going to export my class with my class name and have it extend Lightning element. All right, so a couple keywords that, again, if you don't remember them, you can always look them up. We also see another new word here, this @track. And @track is one of three things called decorators that we're going to be talking about today. And what a decorator essentially does is it gives properties to a variable. So we have our greeting variable with a default value of world. And because we've set @track on it, it's going to do two things. Number one, it's going to make it a private variable. And number two, it's going to make it reactive, which means that anytime it changes, the UI is automatically going to update it. Now, I should note with the summer 20 release, I think all variables are going to be @tracked by default. So we may not see @track being explicitly shown in our code anymore. But if you do see it in previous components moving forward, that's what it's doing. Make it private and make it reactive. So that's why when I type in value to that input, my greeting variable changes because it changes and automatically re-rendered. Now, when it's changing, how is it updating? Remember, we had that on change event that called my method handle change, and that's where this line 6 comes in. So I have my method called handle change. It's going to take in the event, just like we're capturing the event in trigger.new and trigger.isInsert, right? We're capturing information about the trigger event. I'm going to capture the information about the event that caused this change. And I'm going to get the value of the target that that event is responding to. So basically whatever I typed in, and I'm going to set it to my greeting variable. So I type in some value into my input, which the value is greeting. On change calls my handle change method. The event that fired on change has the value I typed in. That value gets stored to greeting because greeting is tracked. It automatically re-renders in my paragraph tag. And that's my entire Lightning Web Component, no Apex required. It's all happening in the browser, and that's why it's very responsive and happening immediately. All right, so what did we just see here? We saw component markup, which we've seen before in Visualforce. We've seen code running in response to events, which again, we've seen before in triggers. We saw variable and method bindings that we're already familiar with. We saw that our controller is part of the bundle, so we didn't have to tell it what controller to talk to. And again, we saw no apex at all in our Lightning Web component. All right, so that's great. There's a lot of stuff that's not changing. Let's talk about some of the more exciting stuff that is changing and some tools that are going to let us start building some more components here. And first, I want to dive a little bit into deeper about why Salesforce changed this Lightning Web Component model so quickly after adopting the Aura model in 2015. A lot of it was really in response to standards. So in 2014, the web looked like this. And don't worry too much about all the words in the boxes, but pay more attention to the scale of the boxes. So the green part of this box here is things that are handled by frameworks. So these are your Reacts or Angulars, right? 2014 frameworks are very heavy and are handling a lot of stuff. The orange box there is going to be the web standards, right? There are some standards there, but they're kind of all over the place and not really doing a lot of heavy lifting. But if you fast forward to 2019, we see that balance has actually shifted quite a bit. So now our orange box, our web standards, are actually handling a lot of the heavy lifting for us. And so the frameworks can be a lot more lightweight, which also means that when you're changing framework to framework, there's not as much stuff you have to relearn because the web standards are staying the same, which is great. Because of that, Salesforce wanted to respond to that. And they've actually joined a lot of web standards boards and are going to have a say in the future of the web, which is pretty exciting. With this change and kind of this balance, though, Salesforce wanted to respond as well. And so they took this kind of fairly heavy Aura framework and decided to move to a little bit different of a direction and take advantage of a lot of that web standard functionality that's built in. And so that's where the Lightning Web Component programming model comes in. So we still have the Salesforce security on top. We still have the Lightning based components like Lightning Input, and we have some other Salesforce libraries as well. But now we're taking advantage of a lot of that web standard functionality. And that's kind of why the Lightning Component framework came into existence, to take advantage of a lot of that standard functionality and make it easier for Salesforce to adapt for the changing web. All right. So with that, let's talk about what's new and exciting with Lightning Web Components. And so one of those things is those industry standards I was just talking about. So with joining all these standards boards, it's going to do two things. Number one, for your own career, it's going to give you more web development skills. So we've seen JavaScript, HTML, CSS. They've been on top for like 7 years now. And so if you're like me and you're a little bit behind the curve in terms of your front-end development capability, this is a great opportunity to jump in and learn skills that will help you not just with Salesforce, but with any web application you might want to build. This is also going to be good for Salesforce development ecosystem in general, because now we can go and say to our web development friends that don't use Salesforce that they can start developing on Salesforce, because a lot of what they're already doing is directly applicable to Salesforce development. They're all using the same web standards, which is pretty exciting in my opinion. And it's going to help the ecosystem grow and keep the long-term health intact. Another thing we're going to see with Lightning Web Components is that where our logic lives is going to change a little bit. So you might be familiar with Visualforce, this concept of throwing anything you want into this bind method syntax, bind variable, bind syntax, and Visualforce will evaluate it. All right, so you might be familiar with this concept of Visualforce. I can have maybe a variable, some hard-coded text, another variable, some more hard-coded text, and Visualforce will say, hey, whatever you want to throw in there, great, we'll evaluate it. And that's kind of a violation of our MVC principles, right? This concept that all of our controller logic should happen in the controller and our view should be for the view. And so with Lightning Web Components, we're going back to that. Our view is just going to display whatever a variable calculation is. We're not calculating things on the view side anymore. All the calculations are going to be happening in the controller itself. We're also going to see this concept of multiple Apex controllers. So with Visualforce, we had the capability to add extensions and things like that, but for the most part, everything was tied to a specific controller. With Lightning Web Components, we're going to be able to have as many Apex controllers as we want. So that's why I like to call it MVC++. Maybe we'll have 2 controllers, maybe we'll have more. We're going to be able to have multiple Apex controllers now and put our logic where it belongs and then bring it in accordingly. Decorators, I talked about one of them briefly. At track, we're going to talk about 2 more as well, but we're going to be able to decorate our variables with properties, similar, this annotation we've seen with @future in our Apex. We're just providing an annotation on our variable that's going to give it some cool properties. Cool. And with that, let's get into a couple other Lightning Web Component demos here. And again, we're going to go through all the code, and the code will be made available to you afterward. But I really want to focus more on the concepts rather than the syntax of the actual code. So if you don't understand a line here and there, don't worry, focus on what the code itself is doing. And you're welcome to go through the code line by line later on. All right, so the first component I want to talk about is this component called create accounts. So I'm going to go create some account records here, and I'm going to do this without using any Apex. So I have this component here. I have an ID box that is disabled. That's just kind of read only. And I have this name box I can type in. I also have this button that says create account. And then I have some text here about creating a record without writing server-side code, and a link to view source that takes me to a GitHub repository with a URL that ends in LDS create record, which is the Lightning Data Service create record functionality. All right, so let me bring my component back up here. All right, so I'm going to create an account here. Let's call it Delhi. Create our account. And we're going to see a toast that our account was created. We're going to get an ID. If I go over to my accounts here, and I refresh, I'll see, sure enough, I have my Delhi account now. I'll go check the ID. And then WAAI, I go back to my create accounts page here. Again, I see my ID showed up here. That's great. If I want to maybe create another account, I change anything in this box. My ID goes away because I'm talking about a new account now. Maybe create a new account called India. Again, I see my account was created. If I go back here to my accounts, I'm going to see my India account showing up here as well. So great, I can create some accounts, and I can do it all without using any Apex whatsoever. Let's go take a look at the code for that to see how that's working here. All right. So the first component I want to talk about is that main one, create accounts. And so this is what the HTML looks like. First thing we see in here is our template tag. So template is kind of similar to Apex page, in which you're pretty much going to see it in all of the Lightning Web Components that you build. It's a standard HTML tag. And it's going to allow us to utilize some more functionality as well. So we're going to see our template tag in all of our components. We're then going to see some Lightning tags. So we have Lightning card, which is similar to Apex. I think Apex forms probably the closest, or Apex page block maybe. And then again, we have our Lightning inputs and our Lightning buttons, similar to our Apex input or our Apex page button. And we see here, we have a disabled ID input. We have a name input that, again, handles the name change in response to an on-change event. So when our value changes, we're going to fire off a method. And then we also see now we have a button, and when we're clicking the button, we're going to respond to an on-click event. And so that's going to call another method called create account. And then on the bottom, we see we have some text here, create a record without writing server-side code. And we see we have another tag starting with the letter C. And it says C view source. And so C, remember, is our default namespace. And this actually refers to another Lightning Web Component we have called view source in our C default namespace. And just like we can pass in variables to Apex methods, we can pass in variables to Lightning Web Components. And so here we're going to pass in a variable LWC/LDS create record, which remember was the end of our URL, as some variable called source in our view source component. So let's dive into that view source component real quick. The view source component is pretty simple. Again, we have our template tag. We have some standard HTML tags here. Again, we have our paragraph tag and a tag, which is just a link. The link tag has a property called href, which refers to the value. When you click on the link, this is the URL it goes to. And here we have a variable called source URL. So source URL is going to take us to our GitHub site. And remember, we passed in a value to our source variable. So we have a source URL variable and a source variable. So if we take a look at our controller here, here's our controller for our view source. Again, we have our import and export statements. We have a base URL, a GitHub repository. And we see our second decorator here, @API. So if you remember @track, it made the variable private, and it made it reactive. Now, by nature of the fact that we pass something into the source variable, as you can probably guess, at API is going to make it public. So at API, I'll make your variable public, and we'll also make it reactive. So whenever it changes, it'll automatically re-render on the UI, and will also allow us to pass values to it from another component. So we passed our LWC LDS create record to source. We see our getter for our source URL, just like we had in Apex. We have our logic in our controller now, and then source URL is going to be rendered in the UI. So all that's happening in our controller here. So we can use this source view source component across pretty much anywhere we want, pass it a different value for source, and all across this GitHub repository, we can link to a bunch of different folders using a single component. And we see that value calculated here. All right, so let's go back to our create record component now. If you remember, we had 2 events we were responding to, on change and on click. So when that value changes I'm typing in, we're going to call handle name change. And when we click our button, we're going to call create account. And the first thing we see here in our create record component is a bunch of different import statements. So again, we're importing from LWC. We're also going to import from the Lightning namespace. So there are a bunch of Salesforce libraries you can bring in from the Lightning namespace that are going to give you a bunch of more functionality. One of which is the toast event we saw that popped up that says success. The other one is the UI record API that's going to do things like creating records without needing any Apex. We can also bring in from custom components that we built. So we can import a component called LDS utils. And we can also import from our database schema. So we can import from, for example, the account object or the name field. So I can import a bunch of different fields, a bunch of different objects, and then give them a name I want to reference later, like account name or account object and name field. So maybe I want to go and change, not in this case because these are standard, but if these were custom and I wanted to change them later, I can reference them using those variables. The Lightning Web Component framework is smart enough that it'll automatically update your code for you when you change a object or field name, as long as you bring it in this way. And as long as you're importing it in with a custom name, it doesn't matter what the name is in the API. We're going to kind of figure that out, calculate that later. But we're going to be able to reference our variables without that having to change. We see our account ID is tracked. So whenever the account ID changes, it'll re-render. And now we see our handle name change event. And again, we're just capturing the event. Whenever it changes, we're going to reset our account ID parameter. And we're going to put the value that fired the event in as the name. So the name will update, and our account ID will be reset because it renders itself in the UI. So that's our handle name change method. And we also saw our create account method when we clicked the button. And so you remember we imported these things from up above. We imported the name field, and we imported the account object. And so this is where we're going to dynamically figure out what those API names are. So in our case, our name field's API name is name. Our account object's API name is account. We're going to put those into a structure called record input. We imported this thing called create record from the record API. We're going to then call create record. And that library is going to be what creates the record without any Apex for us. So we create the record, we assign the account ID that gets returned to our account ID variable, which re-renders because it's tracked. And then we can go display our toast as well. All right. So I want to talk about one more variable here also, or sorry, one more component here also. And that's going to be our wire to Apex component. So this is going to be using Apex. We want to call Apex to display a bunch of contacts and opportunities. So all this component does, calls Apex, displays some contacts and the names, displays some opportunity names, displays the opportunity amounts. And again, we see some text in our view source. And if we view source here, we're going to go to a different GitHub repository called Apex wire method property. So again, we're reusing our resource or view component, passing in a different value to our source variable. Right, so how is this Lightning Web component working? So the component itself is called Apex wire method to property. Here's our HTML. Again, we start with our template tag. Again, we start with a Lightning card tag. And then we're going to have our header for contacts, and then we're going to come down here. And we're familiar with if statements in Apex already. We're going to have an if statement in our Lightning Web component. And the way JavaScript works with true and false is essentially if there's any value there, it's true. If there's no value there, or the value is explicitly false, then it's false. So this is saying if some variable called contacts has some property called data, so if there's a context.data that exists, I want to render this code. If not, we can check context.error down below. And so if context.data is true, we're going to have a for loop similar to an apex repeat in our HTML here. We're going to say for each contact in context.data, display the contact name. And then down here, we're going to say if the context error property is present or has a value, we're going to, again, call a custom component called error panel. We're going to pass in our context.error to the error at API property in that component, and we can render that component there. And we're going to do the same thing for opportunities. Again, we check to see if opportunities variable has a data component. If so, that's great. Display the opportunity name followed by a comma followed by the opportunity amount. And if not, we're going to call our custom error panel again. All right, so that's our UI. The JavaScript controller for this is actually pretty simple. And the whole thing is 8 lines long. And again, we see we're importing from LWC. We see something new here. We're also importing from an Apex class, our contact controller class, specifically the get contact list method. And we're going to give it a name of get contact list. We can call it whatever we want. So we're going to import from one Apex controller. And then we're going to import from our second Apex controller, our opportunity list. And again, we're going to call that get op list. And then that brings us to lines 6 and 7, our third decorator at wire. And so at wire is going to basically take our variable and wire it to something within Salesforce. Could be an Apex class, could be some other library, but we're going to wire it. And at wire is going to do 2 things. One, allow you to connect to something like an Apex class. And it's going to give those variables 2 properties, data and error. So our contacts and opportunities variables here are going to be wired to the get contact list and get op list methods that we imported, the results of which will automatically be stored in the .data properties of those variables. And if there's an error message of some kind, it's going to be stored in the .error part of those variables. So that's why when we're checking for does context.data exist, basically if our Apex worked, then context.data will have the output of our Apex method. If there was some error, then we're going to see a value in context.error. And the same thing for opportunities.data and opportunities.error. The Apex for this is also pretty straightforward. We have an Aura enabled annotation, just like we would with @future. And then we just have a SOQL statement. So we're selecting some fields from contact, we're selecting some fields from opportunity, we're returning a list of contacts and a list of opportunities, and those 2 lists are going to be stored in the .data properties of our variables because they're outwired. And if I go back to my HTML now, again, we're going to see if context.data has a value. So if our SOQL statement returns some contacts, great. Display them all one by one by the name. And if there's an issue, we're going to call our error component. And then we're going to do the same thing with opportunities. So if opportunities.data has our list of opportunities we returned from our Apex, we're going to display the names followed by the amounts. And if not, we're going to call our custom error panel. All right, so what do we see in all these components? We saw more component markup that we're familiar with. We saw more variable and method bindings that we're familiar with. We saw these new decorators at track, at API, and at wire. Remember, at track is going to make a variable private and re-render it on the UI. At API will make a variable public and re-render it on the UI. And at wire is going to allow us to connect our variable to some other class or library and give it the data and error properties. We also saw we can import from pretty much anywhere. We can import from the Salesforce schema. We can import from Apex classes. We can import from web components. We can import from other Salesforce libraries. We can import from LWC. Pretty much anywhere we want to import from, there's a capability to do that. So hopefully by seeing some of this, it's a little bit less scary now that we've seen some of the capabilities, some of the new stuff, some of the old stuff. And hopefully this has helped you get a little more confidence to build your own. All right, so with step one, kind of where do we go from here? How do we take step two and beyond? All right, we talked about how web development's already popular. So if you haven't already started learning about front-end development, now's a great time to do so. Salesforce has evolved to meet the demands of the consumer base. So Lightning Web Components, along with the improved web standards, has allowed Salesforce to embrace those industry standards as well. A lot of similarities between the front end and the back end. But LWC is really the future of Salesforce development, as long as front-end languages like JavaScript continue to stay so popular. And again, this is just step one. So all these slides will be shared with you later, but I've included some more resources in here, just like our Visualforce has a component library. Lightning Web Components have a component library as well. You can find it on the Salesforce developer website. You can also find it by Googling LWC library. There's also a sample gallery on Trailhead with already built apps with already working code. You can get all the code to, including those GitHub repositories I shared earlier. And that'll basically allow you to take existing code, play with it however you like it, and customize it to your needs. Salesforce has a Lightning Components website, lwc.dev. They've come up with a trail mix, sftdc.co/LWC. And the Salesforce instructor that helps people migrate from Aura components to Lightning Web Components. If you're already familiar with Aura components, some more resources to help there, and that's bit.ly/Aura2LWC. All right, so after step two, one thing we didn't really talk about is how to kind of adjust the UI to your liking, things like CSS. I personally am not a fan of writing CSS myself, and Salesforce knows a lot of people aren't either. So they've developed the Lightning Design System, which is basically a bunch of pre-built CSS components and libraries, stylings that you can bring in. Things like adding borders, adding margins, adding padding. You can bring in already pre-built icons. You can bring in things like accordions and progress bars, things like that. A ton of additional capabilities to add some styling and Flash as well. So if you haven't already checked that out, lightningdesignsystem.com, highly recommend checking that out when you're customizing your UI. All right, and with that, thank you so much for having me. Again, feel free to connect with me on Twitter, my website, LinkedIn. The GitHub code that I specifically used is here as well. And then the view source component that's going to be in there is going to have a link to the Salesforce GitHub repository where all of their components exist as well. So yeah, so with that, happy to take questions. And I think we have a quiz for a voucher coming up as well. So I'll pass it back over to Atul or Sushant.
Thanks, Adam. It really was a very awesome session. I know everybody will learn a lot about this LWC and how means what is the difference between the LWC and the other components. It's really a good session. Thank you so much for this. And regarding the questions, I think we have lots of questions. We have around 100 plus comments over comments there. So it's really difficult. Like we can answer. Yes, and you are right. We have a quiz. So guys, like it's time to quiz. So let me share my screen, and it's a 20 MCQ questions, and some of them will be of multi-select questions. Maybe 3 or 4 questions will be multi-select, and I would like to thank Adam for creating this awesome quiz as well. Very good questions, and guys, again in this quiz also you will get to learn more things. So okay, so let me share. Give me a second.
I can stop sharing.
Please let me know when you are able to see my screen. Atul and Adam, please confirm.
Yeah, I can see it.
Yes, I can see it.
I know all the answers there, so
So yeah, disclaimer, like New Delhi team and Adam will not join this session, otherwise they will disqualify. And guys, for each question you will allow 20 seconds to answer. So you have to be quick. And one of you will get a chance to win a Salesforce certification voucher today, for sure. Guys, we will wait 1 or 2 minutes more and then we will start. So I request all the remaining participants who have not joined till yet, please join the app. Okay, so now the number is stable and I think everyone joined. Let's get started. Good luck, everyone. Praveen Jain, keep going, keep going. Urvish, very well. Good luck. Keep going. Guys, you have to be hurry. We have 20 seconds for each question. Sri Ram, playing very well. Good luck. This is a multi-select question, guys. Be attentive. Okay, this is a multi-select question. Sri Ram, you're playing like a pro. Good luck. Keep going. multi-slide question again. Be attentive. Umang, you are playing awesome. You are on a top. Good luck. Good luck. Keep going. Guys, again, this is a multi-select question. Seconds. You have to be quick. So guys, this is the last question. So we have a winner. And guess who is it? It's Umang. Congratulations, Umang, for grabbing the Salesforce certification. Congratulations, you are played really well. In the end, you did a great job, and then you are on the first place. Good luck, awesome. Congratulations.
Congrats, Umang. Congrats, Urvish. And congrats, Shubham. But yeah, Umang, because we have only one certification voucher, guys.
Yeah. Okay. So, Atul, can you please note down the details for Umang, and we will contact Umang after this session.
Sure.
Thank you. And yeah, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's session and today's quiz as well. And again, I would like to thank Adam for his time. I think it's around 12:30 in the night, Adam, if I'm not wrong. As
11:30, not too bad.
okay, again, it's really late. So again, Adam, thank you so much for like your time and sharing your knowledge with all of us. It's a really an awesome session, and definitely we learned a lot today. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys again for having me.
Yeah, Atul, do you want to conclude the session? With,
For sure. Adam, thank you very much. Again, we would like to invite you again sometime, in the next couple of months, because we are having these sessions every week. I know that's a little too much, but yeah, that's how we are doing it. That's how we are rolling for the entire 2020. And it's also, I think, since we are all at homes, and I'm pretty sure we are going to remain at home for the next couple of months more, for the most of part of it. I think this is the best way to go ahead and learn about Salesforce and prepare for the years to come and expand our knowledge. And Adam, people like you has, you coming in and sharing all this knowledge and understanding with us all your insights. It's really, really important, because again, without you, this session was not possible. Again, thank you very much. I would also like to thank all the volunteers. Give a shout out to Sushant, Sagar, and Vishal, Yogesh, and Sachin. These guys have been working day and night to put these sessions together every week after week after week, making sure the content is uploaded on YouTube and SlideShare, and it's all updated on the website where it's available for everyone to see and enjoy and learn. So thank you very much for all you do, guys. Thank you. With that, guys, we are going to conclude the session. Again, follow us at the rate New Delhi SFDC DUG. Follow our YouTube channel. Go ahead and check it out. Check out our website. You will find all the content over there, and we are putting more content on a weekly basis over there. We also have a newsletter that is coming to you every week. We started it 4 weeks back. So every Tuesday, 12 p.m., you are sent out an email with some of the latest updates from the community. And we are going to start soon with the similar thing for Mentorship Central and Talent Central as well. So thank you very much, guys. And yeah, you have a amazing rest of the weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
thank you so much, guys, for joining today's. Thank you so much. Have a nice day, great day ahead, and stay safe and stay healthy.